just actually jump right in if that's okay for everybody. Or maybe I will give it till 9:31 because, like I said, we have 96 people who had signed up for today. And right now we only have 20 participants. So I'll give it another second. Or it's 9:31. So Dan, what do I do? We have 96 that signed up. We've got 20 here. My theory is always to start because there's a start time and an end time. So that's what I'm going to do. Welcome, everybody. As you just heard me, we had 96 that signed up. So as of now, we only have about 20, maybe a little more than 20 that are here, but people keep joining us. But the presentation I'm going to give today has a lot of information in it. And I'm going to do it right and go through all this stuff. But we're going to be pretty close to finishing at 10:30, maybe a little later. Chelsea from my office is sitting here on my screen. She's one of two people that is showing her face. And so as I'm going along, I'm going to be using a PowerPoint. And if anybody has any questions, feel free to unmute yourself and ask the question or put it in the chat box. If you put it in the chat box, Chelsea will interrupt me, which she's not shy about. So today's presentation, now I'm going to start the PowerPoint, and we're going to get going. I got to share my screen. There, you should be able to see the screen now. Now I'm going to say slideshow, start from beginning. Okay, so does Chelsea, you can see me, we're all set? Okay, so what I'm going to be talking about today, structural evaluations, what they are and why you should have one done. Now, I've given a number of seminars and webinars on this. As a matter of fact, I've been on the seminar trail over the last week. I've probably given about 5 or 6 of seminars like this to a lot of different audiences. There's a great interest in this. And you may think that I've given a number of webinars / seminars on this over the past year, actually, and they're all the same. But I promise you that what's going on in our industry is changing on a daily basis in regard to this. So although some of the slides you see, if you sat in on other of these webinars or seminars, or maybe duplicative, I promise you that there's a lot of new stuff going on. I was going to say new and interesting, but I'm not going to use the word interesting for this kind of thing. Just to give you an idea of what's going on in our world, and I think everybody here manages properties or is involved somehow in properties, that's for sure. If you look at the picture on the screen, this is from a building I was in just last week. That's from in a parking garage where obviously they've never done any maintenance. And this is what happens when you do a structural evaluation. Do you think this is a problem? That's a beam that is supporting a lot of stuff. And you can see that the water's gotten into the concrete beam, rusted out the steel, and the steel has popped out the concrete, which creates can create a pretty significant structural safety condition. So this is just from last week. I will tell you that I see this a lot. And if you're involved in the industry and you manage buildings and you walk around them and you look around, you'll see what I'm talking about. So what I'm going to be talking about today is about structural evaluations, what it should include, so it provides the information you need. I'm also going to discuss the various level assessments, including the type of studies that are done, baseline, preliminary, detailed, and I'm going to also include some examples of these type of reports. The other thing I've just added to this as of the last couple of days is that when we talk about structural evaluations, it not only deals with legislation and things like that, but and CAI's public policy, which I'll talk about. But if you live in a community association, you're involved with community associations, you're pretty familiar with what's going on with Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. So they just came out with some updated guidelines as of September, which is in the last couple of weeks. I think it was actually September 18th. So I'm going to touch on what's going on with Fannie and Freddie. And I'm also going to mention, if you're really interested in what's going on at Fannie Freddie and seeing it in great detail, one of my slides talks about a webinar that CAI National is giving Thursday, tomorrow afternoon. I'm going to be going to it, and there are two people that are speaking, and it's being moderated by Dawn Bauman, who's one of the top people at CAI National. And the two people that are on the panel are the people that head up the programs I'm talking about, and Fannie and Freddie. So it's going to be a very interesting webinar. I'm going to sit in tomorrow to see if what I say today is correct. This is what I'm going to be talking about. I'm going to also be connecting together structures, reserve studies, and maintenance, and all kinds of things to show you the connections between everything and what's going on. As far as my background, I've been very involved in CAI nationally in developing the public policy report on condominium safety. I co-chaired that task force. CAI just updated that public policy report, and I chaired it. I chaired that national task force. The draft to that, or the final draft to that, is going to be approved in the next few weeks by the Government and Public Affairs Council, I'm hoping, and then it'll go on to CAI National's board to be approved. But there is an update coming out, which I'll touch on as part of my presentation. And so I've been involved also I'm involved currently in New Jersey on the bill that's Senate Bills 2760 regarding building safety, which is sponsored by Senator Singleton, who I've gotten to meet a number of times, a very nice man. In Delaware, in Newcastle County, they just passed unanimously some new regulations in regards to inspections of buildings. And I co-chair that task force in Delaware, so you can see how I'm spending my life these days. And so there's a lot of stuff going on. Also, I mentioned from the Fannie and Freddie perspective, Fannie and Freddie have asked for input from the world in regard to what they're doing. And I was one of the people that had the opportunity to meet the people at Fannie and Freddie and to talk to them about what's going on. It's actually as part of a little national task force. So as you can see, I'm pretty involved in all this stuff. But what I'm going to be talking about is how to solve problems, not create more. A lot of people look at what is going on and they see these, you say this is creating problems for the people who live and manage our buildings. And I make the argument that it's not creating problems, it's solving problems. The problems have to do with underfunded reserves, which starts at turnover from the developer, no maintenance, which makes condition worse, and no inspections, which lets building age without even knowing the problems that it creates. So, and I'll also touch on cost as part of this, because a lot of people think that by doing what I'm talking about, it's going to cost them more money. It's actually going to cost them less money. And I'll also mention that, let's see, Chelsea, do we have continuing education credits for this?
Yes, we do.
Okay, so if anybody would like to have CEU credits for this, all you have to do is email me or Chelsea, and we'll get your certificate. And we'll also be sending out a copy of this PowerPoint to everybody who attends. So if you're taking notes, you don't necessarily have to. All right, so why is this happening? And I think we all know at this point, the start of the problem, or the sign of the problem, was a tragedy that happened in Florida with the collapse of Surfside, which actually killed, as you all know at this point, 98 people. And it has really made a dramatic change in our industry, which is what we're talking about. It continued to show you that that's not an aberration, what happened in Florida. All the buildings around the country are aging and facing the type of problems that we're talking about, we're trying to solve. And Sea Isle City, New Jersey, we had a balcony collapse on a condominium that killed a worker. New York City, and these are a little outdated because I've used these pictures a few times, because that's not last week anymore, it's probably last month. But there was a parking garage that collapsed in New York because of an aging building. And also there's a lot of problems with parking garages in New York, as well as in many different places. In South Florida, there are a number of buildings that have been forced to evacuate because they've been found to be unsafe. And this is going on because now we're actually taking a look at what's going on with our buildings and finding some of the things that we really don't want to find. Keep in mind, what we're talking about is not because the building was built wrong. It's because in the majority of cases, it's because they're not taken care of as they're aging. After the Surfside collapse, CAI National immediately put together a task force to develop public policy that's currently being used around the country by legislators to develop legislation in different states. I co-chaired this committee, and they came out, as I mentioned before, we came out with a report called Condominium Safety Public Policy Report. And you'll see below it talks about reserve studies and funding, maintenance and structural integrity. And as I mentioned, it's currently been updated. It's now just going through the approval process. But I always have to mention that it says reserve studies and funding. It's very specific in that way. And the reason it says that is because in a number of states, they have legislation that say you have to do reserve studies. In a number of states, it says you have to fund reserves. But in a lot of, there's not an overlap. So in some states, you have to do a reserve study, but it doesn't require you to fund it. In other states, you have to fund, but it doesn't say you have to do a reserve study in order to figure out how much to fund. So that's why you'll see that this public policy, as well as the new reserve study standards, absolutely connect together funding and reserve studies. So the first link to structural safety is structural and facade evaluations. One of the things that has been added, which I'll talk about, is the word facade. When the original public policy came out, it was dealt only with the structures of buildings, and it did not include the facades. Now the public policy includes, in the new update, will include information in regards to facades, which I'll touch on how that's what's going on across the country. And there are a number of ordinances in places having to do with that already. Link two to this whole thing is reserve studies. And when I talk about structural evaluations, the reason this is very important is because the reserve study standards have now been updated to directly connect to a reserve study structural evaluations as well as maintenance. And maintenance is link 3, best practices report on maintenance, which CAI came out with. So if anybody wants a copy of these, you can get them actually from the CAI national website. You can download them, caionline.org. They're free. You can just go onto the website and download them. Or if you'd like copies of them, you just let us know. We'd be happy to send you a copy of any of these reports. But let's talk first about link 1, which is structural safety and the evaluations. So
Hey, Mitch, let me just interrupt you really quick. Chris wants to know, will Mitch cover structural evaluation for condo associations that only have single-family home and two-level townhomes?
That's a great question. Yes, I will, but that you'll see, the reason I added the Fannie and Freddie section to this is because when we're talking about what we're talking now, it may not include those type of buildings, but Fannie and Freddie do. So the answer is yes, but the requirements may come from a different place. So I will get to that, but that's a good question. So the first question is, what is a building structure? A building structure is what holds it up. And this is what it looks like. It's a combination of columns, bracing, beams, foundation, and these type of things. And like I said, a lot of this stuff is duplicative, so I'm going to go through it relatively quickly. But when you measure a structure, what you're looking at is defined as the primary load-bearing system. And those are actually the parts of the building that if one of them disappeared or rotted away or something, it could have an impact in the building in terms of maybe a localized collapse of the building or a total collapse of the building. So that's why it's defined as the primary load-bearing system is what the inspections are based on the public policy. And you notice I say public policy, not based on what Fannie and Freddie say. So it's comprised of the beams and columns of bracing that by interconnection form a path which the forces applied to the building are delivered to the foundation. So I show them here in red for the columns, black for the beams, and blue for the bracing. So just think about this. If any one of these disappeared, then you'd have a collapse or a problem in that part of the building. So if it's at the top, it may be just the top floor. But if this column at the bottom disappeared, then the entire building could collapse. So that's why it's the primary load bearing system that holds up the building. And this is a picture of what it looks like. I was walking through Princeton a few months ago, and this is a building under construction where you could see this is structural steel building. You can see the beams, the columns, and the bracing. So just think about that. If any one of those were to disappear, it would have a significant impact on the safety of the building. Now, I've added to this the facade. The reason the facade has been added is there are probably about 13, 14 cities around the country right now that have facade ordinances in place which require the inspection of facades on an ongoing basis. The facades have now been added to the public policy, and the reason is because we have found that the facade not only makes a building look pretty, but the facade also keeps the water out from water from getting to the inside of the building, so water can get through the facade, get to the primary load-bearing system, and rotted away and caused deterioration. In addition to that, the facade includes things such as balconies. And you saw in the picture a few seconds ago, I think it was in Sea Isle City in New Jersey, that the balconies, although they're not a direct part of the primary load-bearing system, they are a part of the facade. And if something happens to it, it can collapse and kill somebody, like what happened in New Jersey, and it's happened in other places also. So you'll see that when a facade, and the facade is all areas on the exterior of the building, including exterior walls, exterior wall covering, but it also includes everything that's connected to those walls, such as balconies. So that's why the facade has been added, and it's part of the public policy, and it's in part of legislation also. In Delaware, absolutely, it's included. So that's what the building facade is. This is what it looks like. This happens to be a concrete building, and it's got concrete slabs, which you see here with these little outlines around. These are actually called eyebrows. They're concrete that support the floors. They're part of the balconies. But this is a concrete building and a brick facade. So that's what a facade looks like. There are inspections. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, quick question from Tim. Wasn't the Sea Isle City incident caused by improper repair practices?
They really haven't, as far as I know, come out with a report of what happened there yet. I have read some things that talk about there was actually construction going on those balconies to repair them, and one of them collapsed while that was happening. When you look at the pictures, I have my own conclusions about what caused it, which seems to be a combination of the original construction and a lack of maintenance, but the final report hasn't come out on that yet. But I will tell you that is one that collapsed clearly and was a big problem. But we work on a huge amount of buildings, and I can show you pictures that balconies like that are ongoing problems because they're exposed to the environment and maybe the way the handrail posts are connected, but really not 100% sure on why that one collapsed at this point. There are a couple of inspection standards that are out already that are being used. They're put out by the American Society of Civil Engineers. One is a guideline for structural condition assessment of existing buildings. This is for looking at the structure. There's another one called Guideline for Condition Assessment of the Building Envelope. The building envelope is essentially the facade of the building, but also includes the roof. So there are standards out there that are being used. And in the public policy, as well as most legislation I've looked at, they refer to these two standards as the standards that should be used when doing the inspections and preparing the reports. When we originally put together the public policy, what we did is we looked all around the country and around the world to see what other people are doing, so we didn't have to really reinvent the standards. In the United States, we found that there really is no place other than in southern Florida that had any requirements for inspections. And it was the two counties in Florida. One of them is where the collapse took place. So clearly those inspection standards were not adequate. But we did find that in Ontario, Canada, there are specific requirements for doing structural inspections of buildings. And in Singapore, there's very specific requirements for doing keeping structure safe and looking at buildings. So we did look around and use some of these things as standards. I mentioned facades. There are a lot of cities that have facade ordinances that you have to look at them. And as part of my presentation, I'm also showing there are some ordinances that are in place, local ordinances that are coming into place more and more as a follow-up to what happened in Florida. Now I'm going to go through the wording and what the public policy legislation and other things include. What I mean by this is I'm going to touch on all the different things, the different areas. They're included in the public policy. The update to the public policy is kind of a guide. The old public policy, I'm also going to talk about what some other places have used for legislation and the wording they've used. So I'm not tying this directly to any specific legislation, but I want to show you what the typical wording that is used for different things. I will also say that in New Jersey, the legislation very much follows the public policy with some variations. In Delaware, it very much follows the public policy of CAI. So here's some of the wordings of some of the things. The first question becomes, what is a covered building? You know, which buildings require inspections under this public policy? And it's all buildings that have a primary load-bearing system constructed of concrete, masonry, steel, or heavy timber and a building with a podium deck, but not including excluded structures, which I'll get into, because everybody wants to know, are my buildings included? Which gets back to the question a few minutes ago, is a 2-story building or a 3-story building, are those also included? The key point to understand here is that the type of buildings are inspected are based on the type of structural materials that are used, not based on the height of the building. So you could have a 2-story building that is made out of reinforced concrete that would require these inspections, because all the research that everybody's done and the standards that are used are based on material deterioration, not on the height of the building. And it's just as easy for a 2-story concrete building to collapse as it is for a 50-story concrete building collapse. So it's very important to keep in mind that these are based on the type of structure, not the height of the building. I will also tell you that in one particular state I'm involved in, we're getting some pushback because there's all kinds of constituencies involved in these things, where they feel that maybe it should be based on a high-rise building for the inspections and not based on the material type. So that's kind of a little bit of a battle that we're fighting right now, because I'm one that listens to science. So, but a covered building for this includes that material. What's excluded? Now I'm going to show you some pictures of what's excluded. And here you go. The first one is if it's what's called a stick-built building, which is made out of wood, such as what you see here. It also goes by the terminology, an ISO type 6 building, which is a frame building, which is made out of wood, like 2x4s, 2x6s. This is what it looks like this is how you probably recognize it more. These type of buildings, if it's made out of this material, is excluded. It's not heavy timber, it's stick frame, and it's not included. I gave this as a seminar a few days ago, and somebody said, well, why is this not included and the other types of wood and the other type of materials are? The reason is that if you look at this, it's very, very repetitive. So holding up the roof, for example, maybe 100 2x4 wall in the walls. So if something happens to one of them, it's not going to cause a collapse of the entire section of the building, because it's part of the support system, but it's not a primary load-bearing system where one or two things can happen and have an impact on the entire building or a section of it. It's very repetitive. So stick frame buildings are excluded. Now take a look at this. What's included? This is a building where the bottom is made out of reinforced concrete and the top is stick frame. So what's included and what's excluded in this one? In this case, the bottom is included for the inspection because it is reinforced concrete, but the top, which is stick framed, is not. Now you look at it, it's very logical. If something happens to this bottom section, and let's say this one column here collapses, this whole thing's going to go down and take down the stick frame with it above. So this bottom part is included, the top part is not included. One of the things that we've changed in the public policy or clarified in the public policy, as well as some of the legislation I'm involved in, is what is not included. Because people, that's always the question, is our building included? Just like the question a few minutes ago about, for example, if this concrete was the ground, would this top be included? No, it would not. It would not require any inspection. So we also came to the understanding planning for building safety starts when a building is built. So the public policy includes that inspections should be conducted during construction to confirm that the as-built primary load-bearing system matches the drawings. If it doesn't match the drawings, there's a requirement in the public policy that an engineer prepare a report and what are called as-built drawings showing how the structure was built, confirming that even if it wasn't built the way the drawings show, it's adequate to provide the structural strength that was intended, and that before any certificate of occupancy is issued, that type of letter has to be prepared if it doesn't match the drawings. So planning starts when the building is being built. One of the things, if you read the reports about the collapse in Florida, there's a number of reports that have been coming out recently, and it talks about how in some cases, the reinforcing steel in the concrete does not appear to have been put in the way the drawings show it. And so that clearly was a contributing fact to the failure in addition with no maintenance and all the other things that went on. But if this type of requirement was in place at that time, it would have been reviewed to make sure it matches the drawings, and it would have been corrected, or a letter would have been issued saying it's equivalent. So planning for building safety starts when it's being built. Also, the other thing is, when a building's age, and we're talking about community associations, obviously, in most places, legislatively, a developer is required to provide a reserve study as part of the governing documents and as part of the initial budget. The public policy now requires that in addition to a reserve study, it includes a maintenance plan. How do you maintain the building, the primary load-bearing system, and the facade? And the developer is required to include in the governing documents a maintenance plan, not only the plan, but the money to execute that plan. And while the developer's in control, the developer should be performing the maintenance. This is in the legislation. The maintenance plan is in the legislation in New Jersey, and it's also in the legislation in Delaware. So this is something new where it's a requirement, not just a reserve study, but also to include the maintenance plans and funding for it. The other thing that the public policy says is that in the initial budget, if it's the type of building I talked about, it should include in the original budget the cost of doing the periodic inspections and the frequency for doing them, which I'll talk about in a minute. So these are some pretty big changes in terms of, I guess, a developer's responsibility when they're putting together a community, but also keep in mind that the public policy and the recommendations of best practices are that once the association takes control, they should do these things too. So this is, again, showing that building safety starts when it's built. What about the first inspection? If the building is built after the passage of the legislation, the recommendation is the first inspection take place within 15 years of the effective date of these policies. The reason why it's 15 years, because a lot of people think it's a long time, and we were actually looking for something slightly less than that, but we've settled on 15 years, is because under the new legislation, the new requirements and new public policy, maintenance would be performed. So the building would be inspected on an ongoing basis, and maintenance, and the maintenance which would be performed to keep the building from deteriorating. So that's the first inspection if it's created after the bill. If the building was built prior to a bill's passage, there's some very old buildings and that have never been looked at. So the requirement is in the public policy that the first inspection of all these buildings would take place within 2 years after the effective date of the policy, so that everything is looked at. Now that has run into some problems in the number, and the primary reason for that is because of the number of buildings that are older from prior to the putting these policies in place, and the number of engineers available to do the inspections. For example, I was just talking to somebody, I think it was actually yesterday, that was telling me in Florida, where they have these regulations in place already, that the first inspection has to be done within 2 years, but there aren't even enough engineers in the state of Florida to do these type of inspections. The other thing is in New Jersey, as far as the legislation, the dust hasn't 100% settled on this yet, but I'm anticipating that the first inspection for buildings prior to the legislation may be phased over a number of years based on the age of the buildings, because of the number of buildings and the number of engineers available to do the inspections. So that's why this is what the public policy says on the right, but on the left, I kind of put an asterisk on it because it's a work in progress and it changes based on how many buildings and the availability of engineers to do this type of inspection. What does the first report include? The first report is known as essentially a baseline report, because it's a baseline to look at the building in order to measure it against in the future to see if there's any ongoing deterioration. So the first report that's done should include at a minimum any maintenance that's needed or repairs that's needed. Corrective maintenance just by definition for you means that if you look at something and because it essentially was never maintained, it needs to be corrected, it's corrective maintenance. You can kind of interchange it with the term repairs, but I put both of them in here just so it's covered, that everybody understands exactly what it means. But a structural report should say any place that corrective maintenance is needed or repairs necessary for the primary load-bearing system. Keep in mind, these inspections, the first report may be done within 2 years, but still it's looking, because deterioration of buildings can happen pretty quickly. It should also determine when the next inspection shall be performed, and I'll get into that in a second, and it's based on the condition of the building. and it should provide any other information or guidance necessary to maintain the structural integrity of the covered building. Now, keep in mind, if you look at the top, it says the protocol for these inspections can be found in the ASCE standard, which I mentioned before. And in that standard, there's a few different types of inspections, which I'll touch on, but this is what's called a preliminary assessment. And basically, if a preliminary assessment means you look at everything and you see any conditions that would make you nervous, for example, and if you see any potential problem areas, then in that area, a detailed assessment needs to be done. But this is what the first report needs to include based on public policy. Subsequent reports, the general guideline is you're going to look to see if there are any progressive deterioration, anything's getting worse, because things do get worse over time, especially if you don't maintain them. But the subsequent reports take place for the first 20 years, a maximum of every 10 years. And after the building is 20 years old, a maximum of every 5 years. Now, the reason it says maximum or not to exceed is because if you go back a slide, it says that the structural report shall determine when the subsequent inspection shall be performed. Because even though it says that for buildings up to 20 years old, you should do the maximum every 10 years, if you look at the building and it's not in such great condition, the recommendation may be that the next inspection take place in 5 years. So that's why in both cases, it says shall not to exceed. Also, anytime there's concern about safety or stability of the structure, an inspection should be conducted immediately. So if a manager goes walking through a parking garage, just to use my favorite example, a parking garage, and sees something, they may require, or they should require, that inspection be performed immediately and not wait until these periodic inspection timeframes. The subsequent reports shall include, it's pretty much the same thing. It should make note of any any new or progressive deterioration, set forth what the corrective maintenance or repairs are, determine when the next inspection should be performed, and again, providing information and guidance necessary to maintain the structural integrity. So it's not just a matter of fixing something that's bad, but the report should include guidance in regard to any recommended maintenance that should be performed to maintain the structural integrity of that covered building. So that's what that report should include. Now, the question comes up a lot is who should prepare these reports and who signs off on it? It's by a licensed engineer with the appropriate qualifications. For example, it says in the public policy, licensed in the state in which the building is constructed, because then those engineers are more familiar with the construction that's taking place because they're local. But it says licensed engineer with the appropriate qualifications. Now, the reason the appropriate qualifications is there is because there are many, many structural engineers out there, but some of those structural engineers don't have the appropriate qualifications. For example, in order to do these type of inspections, you need to know what happens and what are the signs of problems in buildings as they age, as opposed to a structural engineer that just designs new buildings. So licensed engineer with the appropriate qualifications are very important. The other question is, and you'll see some pictures, is that most of the signs of problems are rusting, y'all get into it. But the question is, why a licensed engineer? Because somebody else can look at it and see where there are problems due to rusting. The difference is that a professional engineer who has experience in structural design and of existing buildings can make an assessment whether or not that rusting, depending on where it is, affects the safety and the strength of those beams or columns or whatever it is. So a PE understands what the impact can be, although somebody else can identify rusting in those type of conditions. So now, does anybody have any questions about that so far? Now I'm going to get into Fannie and Freddie for a second, but then I'm going to go back to what is a typical structural inspection report look like, so you can get a feel for what should be included and how it should be prepared. So if there's any questions, jump in the chat room or jump in. So now let's talk about, by the way, I'm a little surprised. I'm looking that we have 32 participants. As of yesterday, we had 96 people who had signed up. So where is everybody? So let's talk a little bit about Fannie and Freddie. Now, the first thing I want to do is explain who is Fannie and Freddie, because most people don't understand really how this system works. There's a governmental agency called the Federal Housing Finance Agency. It's a government agency that regulates Fannie and Freddie. So FHA oversees Fannie and Freddie, which together are known as sponsored enterprises or GSEs. I'm not really government-sponsored enterprises. That's what Fannie and Freddie are known as. The FHFA sets the standards for mortgages that are purchased by Fannie and Freddie. So Fannie and Freddie will purchase mortgages. The reason they purchase mortgages, they purchase them from banks in order to give banks the more capacity to lend more money and to make more loans, because each bank has a capacity. But then if Fannie and Freddie buy the loans from them or take over the loans, then they have the more capacity to do more loans. So the FHA sets the standards for the mortgages that are bought by Fannie and Freddie. Banks and other lenders that originally, I'm sorry, somebody, if you wouldn't mind reading. So banks and other lenders that originate loans with the intention of selling them to Fannie or Freddie must comply with the guidelines that Fannie and Freddie live by, which are set by FHFA. So FHA will say to Fannie and Freddie, you need to include safety requirements in order to be an approved loan. You may have reserve requirements for minimum reserves and things like that, which I'll talk about. But the banks need to, in order to sell their loans to Fannie or Freddie, need to meet these guidelines. So what happens is Fannie and Freddie have specific guidelines for condo projects, which I'm going to touch on in a second. Lenders, including banks that wish to sell the mortgages to Fannie and Freddie, must meet those guidelines. And obviously the impact on people that are buying condos or refinancing condos is that this gives them more availability to mortgages. So that's the connection between all of them. Now, what I'm going to go through, so it's kind of interesting because when you see the forms, like the Fannie or the Freddie forms, the banks can use their own forms and their own format to gather information, but it still has to meet the requirements of Fannie and Freddie. So, and again, I am going to refer you to tomorrow, and I'm going to be attending, let me go to my next slide. Tomorrow, CAI is giving a webinar on exactly this topic with somebody from Fannie and Freddie attending. But so when you look at Fannie and Freddie loans, the question is not what makes them applicable and good, but they have lists of what makes a project ineligible. So I'm going to go through a couple of things that make the projects ineligible, but only based on safety and reserves. I'm not getting it based on how many renters are involved in communities or anything like that. Keep in mind, it says Fannie Freddie new lender requirements were effective September 18th, I think it was. So what is a covered building when you're talking about Fannie and Freddie? We talked about, when you're talking, and this goes back to the question from a while ago, a two-story building, is that included? Now, under the primary load-bearing system, if it's a stick-framed building, it is not. But now you look at what is a covered building relative to the Fannie and Freddie requirements. A project refers to a condo, housing co-op, or any multifamily common interest association with more than 5 attached units. So if you have a building that is 2 stories high with attached units, and it's more than 5 attached units, then it meets the Freddie requirements. So the Fannie and Freddie requirements are much more stringent than just the primary load-bearing system, which I talked about before, because it covers anything with more than 5 attached units, stick frame, no matter what it is. So the project standards are the specific requirements I talked about before, and the mortgage lender must verify each project is satisfactory. Now, to show you the extent of this, as of 2023, Fannie and Freddie accounted for more than 70% of the mortgage market. Now, I make the argument all the time that we can have legislation in individual states to make our buildings safe. And one of the things I've learned is that legislation in the states vary based on who the constituents are. And I'm a strong believer that Fannie and Freddie are going to have more of a consistent impact on keeping our buildings safe than legislation will. And I've had the opportunity to meet with people from Fannie and Freddie and FHFA, and all of them are very strong supporters of keeping the buildings that people live in safe. Obviously, they want to protect the mortgages also, so with less risk. But everybody I've met is very nice, and they're really a lot of the reason they do this also is to make sure our buildings are safe. So, but 70% of the mortgage are Fannie or Freddie. So what are some of the things they say? What makes a project ineligible? If the project, now here's where you get into the wording of what does it really mean? it says the project will be deemed ineligible if it requires critical repairs, there is a current evacuation order due to unsafe conditions, if there are unfunded repairs totaling more than $10,000 per unit. So that's when it comes to the physical property. I'm not getting into the insurance or number 4 and 5, but 5 is the budget, reserves. For Fannie, it says at least 10% of the budget that you have must be for reserves. For Freddie, it says you can go less than 10% if you have a reserve study that supports the lesser amount. So these are the general requirements, but then you look at this as far as safety in the building and ineligibility. What does critical repairs even mean? So then you go into the definitions. Definitions. Let's see. I want to go to where is I'm going to. I don't have them really in the right order. So let's talk about critical repairs. They say a definition is critical repairs is repairs and replacements that significantly impact the safety, sound, and structural integrity of the habitability of a project's buildings, that or that impact unit values, financial viability, or marketability. These include material deficiencies which uncorrected a potential result in critical element failure, mold, or water intrusion. So keep in mind that this may not be a structural safety issue, but if there's any mold, water intrusion, or potentially damaging leak to the project's buildings that have not been repaired, that's considered a critical repair and could be a reason for not granting a loan. Advanced physical deterioration. So these are the things that are defined as critical repairs. But now, how do you work a little backwards to see what this really means? Because it says if it's critical repairs, it's ineligible, but if there are routine repairs, it is eligible. So what is a routine repair? It's something that's preventive in nature or part of normal capital replacements, and it's accomplished within the project's normal operating budget or through special assessments that are within guidelines. Because keep in mind, if there's a special assessment for fixing a critical repair, they won't it's still ineligible until that critical repair is fixed if there's a special assessment. So when you look at this, there's a lot of different things in here. And the question is, how do you document this and what do you show? And for example, when you talk about documentation, it says the lenders, not Fannie, but the lenders, the bank, in order to say that it meets their requirements for a loan, because they're telling Fannie and Freddie they do, lenders may need to review a combination of documents to determine if a project meets their physical condition requirements. And it also say lenders are responsible for determining which documents are needed. They can include things such as the association's board meeting minutes, engineering reports, which I'll get into in a second, structural and/or mechanical inspection reports, reserve studies, a list of necessary repairs, other substantially similar documentation. So when a bank looks at this to determine if it's eligible or ineligible from their perspective, they look at this documentation to determine that. Now, here's another thing. It says in there, in the requirements, in regards to inspection reports, and you'll see that I highlighted only one word here. The word is if. It says, if a structural or mechanical inspection was completed within 3 years of the lender's project review, the lender must obtain and review the inspection report. So the word if is kind of interesting to me, because if you've had it done, you have to provide it and they have to review it, but you've never had it done, there's nothing to provide, so there's nothing for them to review. But this is what they say about inspection reports. Now, if you look at some of the forms you have out there, the first question it asks in the addendum is, has there been an inspection performed of the community? And I forget the exact words. It doesn't say there that you have to do inspection. It says, has there been an inspection done? If there hasn't been one done, you just say no. But I just wanted to show you some of the things that Fannie and Freddie in their requirements have in place as far as inspection reports, documentation, critical repairs, routine repairs. But I would also suggest that, like I said, tomorrow there's a webinar by CAI to show this is real-time stuff. And if you look here, you'll see that it's being moderated by Dawn Bauman, friend of mine, who is the Chief Strategy Officer of CAI. The panel is Jody Horn, who's the director of all of this stuff for Fannie. And Jody and Jacqueline are very nice, and Jacqueline for Freddie. So these guys are going to be presenting, and I'm wondering if they're going to be taking questions, because a lot of the things I brought up, I'm sure there's going to be a lot of questions. I'm sure a lot of people are going, and that's something you may want to take a look at. If you go, I've got a couple of links here to what the Fannie and Freddie guidelines are, which I've looked through. If you want them, those are the links. But that's what's going on with Fannie and Freddie. Does anybody have any questions about that? Because it goes back to the question a while ago, is this two-story building covered? And the answer is under Fannie and Freddie, yes. Did anybody have, Chelsea, any other questions about the Fannie and Freddie stuff?
Not in the chat right now. If anybody wants to unmute themselves and ask right now, feel free.
Okay, or feel free to email me after, but and maybe I'll give another webinar on Fannie and Freddie next week after I get some of the questions I'm talking about answered tomorrow. So what's on the way? In New Jersey, legislative initiative, it's S2760. It requires periodic inspections of the structure. It requires reserve studies and funding, and it requires maintenance. And I'm going to go through some of the things that are in it. In Delaware, this was already passed. Newcastle County Common Interest Community Association recommendations were passed unanimously about a month ago, and it includes structure and the facade. Difference here is in New Jersey, it's only the structure. But what we've done in the New Jersey legislation, it says structure, but the structure is defined to include balconies. So although we don't have the full facade in there in the wording, we do have balconies because that's a problem area that we talked about. In Delaware, it's the structure and the facades, which obviously include the balconies and maintenance. There's already local requirements in place in New Jersey and in other places. Jersey City, Cliffside Park, and Hackensack. In Jersey City, it says a structural inspection has to be done every 10 years, which pretty much matches what I talked about before. And then there are certain requirements. For example, it says the initial inspection shall be completed by December 31st, 2022. I wonder if that was done. We have done a few of them, but every 10 years. Jersey City, these are the requirements. Now, it's interesting because if you look for the structural requirements, it includes things such as that, to me, really are not part of the structure, but it's kind of interesting. But they actually give you a checklist of what you need to look for when you're doing a structural inspection. It's a checklist plus any other things you see, but they specifically give you a checklist. In Jersey City also requires that the facades be inspected every 5 years. And you see, it says here, facade inspections every 5 years by a licensed architect or engineer. In the public policy, where it talks about facade inspections, it says by a licensed architect or an engineer with the appropriate experience, as I talked about before. For the structural inspections, it says by a licensed engineer. It's not an architect, because architects generally do not have expertise in structure. But for the facades, they do. So that's why for the facades, it includes both. So Jersey City has structure and facade. Again, here's the list of things that should be included in the facade inspection. Now let's go to Cliffside Park. Cliffside Park, New Jersey says structural inspection every 10 years. And the covered building I didn't go over in Jersey City, but just an example, in Cliffside Park, it says a covered building is all existing buildings constructed of steel, stick, brick, stucco, or fabricated panels, and or concrete buildings more than 4 stories in height. So they base it on 4 stories, but they say if it's a building that's less than 4 stories, but it has excess of 12 units, that has to be inspected. So this is their variation on the theme of what has to be inspected. Cliffside Park also has facades, and it's every 5 years. They say facades, anything that's more than 3 stories in height. Keep in mind that I didn't mention it before, but a covered building for a structure is based on the type of material. The covered building for a facade is based on the height of the building. So it's generally 3 or 4 stories. And if I remember correctly, the public policy says that it's any building that's 4 stories in height or more. But if it's less than that and it has balconies, the balconies shall be inspected. So there's kind of variations on the theme, but variations, but similarities. In Hackensack, a number of years ago, they had a collapse of a parking garage. They require that all parking garages be inspected every 5 years. It says parking structure every 5 years. And we just recently did about 4 or 5 parking garage evaluations in Hackensack, but there's different requirements. The process I talked about is preliminary and a detailed evaluation, which I mentioned before. Preliminary, I talked about, identifies the conditions. I'm kind of some duplicative stuff. Now, detailed goes into more detail. Now, I want to show you what an evaluation report looks like based on these standards. Based on the Kipcon standards, but which are based on those standards. It has the evaluation includes what's included, table of contents, attachments, description of the structure, type and materials that are used. In this example, it was reinforced concrete structure and describes what it is. Description of the structure, then there's pictures. It shows the concrete beams, in this case, concrete columns, and it also shows something from the original design drawings that we happen to have in this building when we did the inspection. Keep in mind, these original design drawings are not always available. Then it's the description of the facade. In this case, we did the facade inspection. Then it says, what's the methodology of the inspection? For example, when we did the garage, we started here, walked back and forth, took pictures of everything. Then that's how we evaluated the garage structure. For the facade, we use drones for all the facade inspections as a starting point. We started up on the top and we flew back and forth over every level of the building, looking at the facade. And then what happens is you take pictures. I'm going to jump here because I want to show you that we take a location. For example, you look here, this little red square, that's this column. So when we did our inspection, we show on the plans exactly where the column is, and then we show all 4 sides of the column. So you have the condition, then we identify any observed deficiencies. This is in the parking garage. We identify the deficiencies with a description, a picture, and a location. This is a few different ways we did it. This one is taken over the facade where we're showing the locations, where it is on a plan, and the picture. Those are taken by drone. Again, another example of the facades. This is another one where it shows the actual picture and the location. Then in the findings, it's very important. One of the most important parts of the findings is to come up with a rating system. And if you look in these standards I talk about, they have rating system standards. In the city of Philadelphia, they have facade ordinances, and they give you the rating system that you're supposed to use. But the rating system that we used in this case is severe, moderate, or minor. And for severe, for example, the recommendation is a detailed inspection and remediation in the immediate future. Moderate requires a secondary inspection within 12 months. And then minor does not require immediate action, should be re-inspected within 3 years. So you see that we're making recommendations for when the next inspection should be done that are sooner than what the standards are for every 10 years up to 20 years old, and then every 5 years maximum after that. But this is a description of our findings. And then we go through and we show the picture of the condition, the location, a picture, a close-up, exactly where it is. And then we define what it is, what's the severity. And in this case, it was minor. In this one, this is moderate. And this is another example, and this is severe. You could see that the concrete is falling off, the reinforcing steel is rusted, and this was considered a severe condition. And in this case, they had a detailed inspection done. They actually had us do a specification to repair this area because it was severe. It was a severe condition. Here's another one, some more severe conditions. And then that's essentially what goes into the structural inspection evaluation reports. Then the next thing is reserve study standards. I'll go through this relatively quickly. That the reserve study, these are in a lot of legislation. For example, in New Jersey, it's both about structural integrity as well as reserve studies. And it talks about that the reserve study, the problem in New Jersey, for example, is that when a developer creates a community, they are required to set up adequate reserves in the originally governing documents. After the association takes control, they don't have to. This is going to put legislation in place that says associations in New Jersey need to have a reserve study and need to fund adequately. The reserve study has to be prepared in conformance with the National Reserve Study Standards of CAI, which I mentioned. And the bill goes on to say that if it's not adequately funded, based on certain criteria, you have to get to adequacy within either 10 years or 2 years. So there's very specific things in here. There's also a definition of what adequacy means. For those of you who know reserve studies, and I think most of you do, adequacy is defined as anything in which you're running to a deficit is essentially adequate. Inadequate, we won't have enough money to do the work. And it also says that the reserve studies in New Jersey will have to be updated every 5 years, maximum every 5 years. This is where it talks about adequacy and what it defines. How long of a makeup period you have if you're not adequately funded. And if anybody has any questions about that specifically, I'd be happy to answer. The next thing is we talk about, I'm sorry, did somebody have a question? The next thing is maintenance plans. CAI came out with this report on best practices report on maintenance. Maintenance is absolutely critical. I think I mentioned there's 3 types of maintenance. Deferred maintenance, which means the postponing of maintenance or not doing it. Preventive maintenance is an ongoing preventive maintenance plan where you proactively do things, which include inspections. Corrective maintenance is fixing things when you don't do any type of maintenance. There's another slide that's coming up, I think, but just to give you an idea in terms of cost. Preventive maintenance typically costs about 5% of the replacement cost of a component. So if you look at your reserve study, add up the total replacement costs of all the components and take about 5% of that, distributed over the cash flow projection period, that's about how much you should be spending on preventive maintenance as a guideline. If you don't do preventive maintenance, you have to fix something instead. Add up all your preventive maintenance costs and multiply it by 50, and that's how much it's going to cost you. It's going to be significantly more expensive to fix something than it is to maintain it, which is why I always make the argument that these type of plans and doing these things are actually going to save you money, not cost you money. Now, this is the connection between maintenance, reserves, and structure. A lot of times, and that picture on the first slide today showed it to you, but you have a deck above, podium deck, that has a membrane that keeps the water from going through. That membrane goes on your reserve study. Let's say it has a 15-year useful life. If you maintain it, and anytime you see a leak, you fix it, for example, then it'll last the 15 years. If you don't maintain it, it's going to have to be replaced sooner than 15 years, which will cost you more, but the water's going to get through and rot out the structure, which is going to cost you a lot of money to fix. And when you looked at the picture on my first slide, that was a situation where water has been leaking through a deck there for years and years and years, which is exactly what I'm talking about here. And it shows how if those joints and when water was coming through was fixed at that point, they wouldn't be spending $1 million to fix their structure. Again, I mentioned the difference in cost, life cycle costs. Here's some of the things that we see. And as managers or homeowners, I don't know exactly what the audience is, but if you see signs of deterioration, have it evaluated. These are some common things we see where people put gutters and downspouts in so water doesn't drip on cars, but at the same time, it doesn't take into account where the water is coming from and the fact that if you look at this picture, it's having a significant impact on the structure. Here's another one you see, rust signs. That means the steel inside of the concrete beam is rusting. This white over here is called efflorescence. That's stage 1. You see the water coming through. It's showing this white, which is like a salty type materials. Next week, this is going to turn orange too because it's going to start showing the rust. This is another one with gutters and downspouts. This is something, we'll look at this on the bottom left. The concrete had fallen off and exposed the reinforcing steel. So they put up a net so the concrete wouldn't fall in the cars, but they didn't fix it. Another way to divert the water, these are just pictures. This is another gutter. This is one where we just took this gutter off and found some damage behind that. That's a building in Philadelphia, if I'm not mistaken. Now, this is actually my last slide, but it's one of my favorites because they had water coming in. They didn't want it to go on the cars. So they put this thing here. It's like a siding to divert the water so it doesn't go onto the cars. They diverted it directly onto the steel beam, and you can see what it's doing to the beam. It's rusting away the beam because they directed the water there. So that's, let me see, how am I doing? Oh, exactly 10:30. So that's everything. If anybody has any questions, I'm going to stop the share. And if anybody has any questions, I'd be more than happy to answer. We will also send you all a copy of the presentation. And if there's any of the handouts or the references I mentioned in here that you'd like a copy of, let us know, just email us. And anybody have any questions about or anything, or did I cover it all? I'm surprised I got it done in an hour.
That was very good. We do we do have a question from Chris. I apologize, Chris. This was about 15 minutes back. It was about I believe it was during the Fannie Freddie conversation, but our condo association has many villa townhomes. However, all are 2, 3, or 4 attached block structures. None are 5 attached units. Does this arrangement comply?
That's pretty interesting because you're probably exempt because it says attached 5 or more. So it shows the logic sometimes of these things, but you're probably exempt. Anything else?
Good morning, Mitch. Thanks for your time. This is very informative and I truly appreciate it. I'm just wondering, with new building construction practices, migrating away from, steel rebar that's not epoxy coated, do we see new practices where there are improvements to reduce or minimize this kind of problem, number one? And then number two, in terms of the state legislation that you're developing for New Jersey, is there a timeline when you think that might actually pass? I understand that the wheels of bureaucracy can be slow sometimes. And then the goal, my hope would be that it would be standardized for the state opposed to different municipalities coming up with their own guidelines.
They're all good questions. I'll start the last one because I can't remember the first one anymore. And you see Chelsea has a little baby in her lap now. It's a great question because, first of all, the legislation in New Jersey does not include facades. The legislation in the local ordinances do include facades. So the question is, what overrides what? And it's my understanding, because we've asked this of Senator Singleton, is that he would like the state regulations to override the municipalities. But if the municipalities have something more stringent than the state regulations, they could do it on their own. So, for example, for structure, the way I kind of read what he said, for the structure, it would be based on the state, so it's consistent. For the facade, since it's over and above the state, it would not be included, or it would be done by the local ordinances. One of the things I've learned in the political system, and by the way, I've met a lot of politicians in New Jersey over the last year because of this, and 99.9% of them are all out there for the good of us. So what you see on the news every day is not really, you shouldn't watch the news, but the other thing I've learned is that once you submit a bill for review and it gets into the process, it's very hard to make any changes to it because it's in the process already. And the reason I say that is because if we were to go back now, and I hope nobody political in the state of New Jersey is listening to this, but I think if we were to go back now, we would have included in there facades, not just structure. But we were able to get facades in there in terms of the balconies by just adding the word balconies, but we weren't able to make the change to include the facade the way the public policies now say it and the way Delaware says it, for example. So can you repeat your first question?
Yeah, it has to do with new construction and practices evolving.
All right,
in the old days, rebar was uncoated. Now it is. Do you see standards changing to utilize things like coated rebar to minimize spalling and so forth?
It's a great question. And just so everybody knows, steel, the regular steel that goes into concrete is just essentially bare steel. It's supposed to be a certain distance from the surface of the concrete so water can't get to it. Over time, water gets to it. That's all there is to it. The concrete sucks it in, the water gets to it, especially if it's a horizontal surface exposed to rain. It rusts. There are other types of reinforcing out there. One of them is called epoxy coated. Epoxy coated means that the steel is covered with something that the steel itself can't get wet. I am not aware of anybody that is using epoxy coated steel in new construction. I think that what may come out of this ultimately is maybe a code change that says that anytime you have an exposed to the element concrete structural part that has reinforcing steel in it, if it's exposed to the elements, it will need to have epoxy coated. That's where I'm thinking it may end up, but I really haven't seen it, which runs into other things. For example, if you have a parking garage which are big problems. I see it all the time. And cars drive into it in the winter. It drags water in. That water has salt in it from the salt on the roads. And keep in mind that salt in water causes the deterioration of steel to happen faster. So it's dragging all this in there, but then the water sits on the concrete and is absorbed in and gets the reinforcing steel. In some buildings, they have a membrane on top of the concrete in a parking garage. In others, they don't. I know of a new building. I'm not aware of any building code that requires that parking garage slab to have a coating on it to protect it against moisture. So that may be another change to the code that requires it. So this is, it's evolving even now as we speak. And I kind of think that's where it may be headed. I've been involved in other type of structures, like for those who are familiar with cooling towers that have a lot of water. They always use epoxy coated steel because they're constantly wet. But it's a great question, but the legislation doesn't handle it. I haven't really seen it, the impact of it, but I think it may be coming with some code changes.
Yeah. Also, estimated timeline on when you think the legislation might pass?
Well, hopefully it'll pass. It's working its way through the process. I've learned about the government process, and it has to go through a bunch of committees. We presented it to a number of committees. We're in the process right now of meeting with the legislators in New Jersey that need some more information in regard to what it is. For example, I'm going to something tomorrow to meet with a legislator. One of the things I've learned about this system, about fundraising, oh my goodness. I've been to so many political fundraising events to have the opportunity to talk to a legislator about this bill. So I don't know. I'm hoping it's relatively soon, but I don't even know 100% how the system works. I will tell you that we get, let's put it this way. Out of all the pushback we've had in regard to this, I think CAI is the only one who has an engineer who has technical knowledge responding to and making comments. We get comments about this from people that don't know engineering, and they say it shouldn't be this way. For example, somebody right now is saying it should be limited to high-rise buildings. Why? Because they're high, and if they collapse, it'll kill more people, as opposed to a two-story concrete building that collapses that doesn't kill a lot of people. I mean, the logic I see is crazy. So I could talk about that one for a while too. So hopefully it's soon, and but I don't know. Anybody else? No, I see. Chelsea, I see 11 things in the chat. Is there anything else?
We went through all those. Now you're just getting kudos at the end.
Oh, kudos. Okay.
Mitch,
Sorry?
maybe just one more question, Mitch. I wanted to give time for others, but since they're not stepping up, one last question. In the standard reserve study that happens, every 5 years or so at the choosing of the HOA, if you saw spalling issues, I would hope that you would point it out and make the recommendation for an engineering study. Would that be true?
Oh, that is an awesome question. I'll tell you why. First of all, I'll say that the national standards say for reserve studies and the New Jersey legislation say a maximum of 5 years. The best practice says to update them every 3 years. For those of you really into reserve studies, if you're using baseline funding, it should probably be 1 year. If you're using full funding, it should be 5 years. So it's all over the place. But it's a great question, because when we updated the national standards on reserves, and I co-chaired this task force, the question was exactly that. To become a reserve specialist through CAI, you do not need to be an engineer. And I would say less than 50% of the RSs across the country are engineers. And I would also say that every single one of them is in panic mode about disclosing anything they see, such as a potential problem, because of the risk involved. So most people, what the new standards have in them, and if I had a minute, I'd share it with you, is a typical disclosure that it's recommended to be put inside of every reserve study, saying, we're only here to look at this. We are not here to evaluate the structure, because everybody is afraid of the risk that if they don't see something, or if they say something and they don't say something else and something happens, the association or somebody's coming back after them. It's a great question. There aren't many firms. Well, I will tell you what we do. If somebody in the office sees something, we will say something. But we're very clear in our wording that we only happen to see this. For example, I don't know the exact wording. We did not look at the structure, but we saw this and you should evaluate it more clearly. But we do that as if we see something, but we're not looking for it. We're not actively looking for that. It's not because of the risk factor. So it's a great question.
Yeah.
You know,
I asked that. I asked that because there are some HOAs that are rather laissez-faire, and rather than calling in an engineer, they call, you know, a homeowner who might be a concrete guy and say, oh yeah, those cracks are normal, there's nothing to worry about, when in fact there is something more substantial taking place.
Yeah, I will tell you that the best practices in the public policy and that best practices report on maintenance suggest that it's not a reserve study, but as part of a preventive maintenance plan, it includes an inspection of the site once a year. And for example, when we do we're retained to do preventive maintenance schedules or plans for communities. We always include in there the cost of doing a visual observation once a year as part of the preventive maintenance. And as part of that, you do look at the observable structure, but also keep in mind that, and in New Jersey, most reserve companies are also PEs that do this kind of thing. But across the country, most of them are not. The other thing is, if you're looking for a business opportunity, there are 358,000 community associations in the United States. Fannie and Freddie are requiring reserve studies, you know, to these type of things. Insurance companies are requiring reserves because of the risks. Statutory requirements are saying you have to do reserves. And there's 358,000 associations. How many RSs do you think there are in the United States?
Not 358,000.
299.
Wow. Wow.
And
right.
In my conversations I had with the people at Fannie, even the last couple of weeks, you know, you're talking about setting a standard for doing a reserve study. And the comment is, there aren't enough people to come close to doing the number of reserve studies. If we said it has to be done by an RS and it has to be done in accordance with the standards, that's why Fannie and Freddie say that, oh, a standard is 10% of your annual operating budget, because that's the way around it, even though they understand and they recognize the fact that 10% doesn't really reflect on the common elements. It's just a number that they use. So they're putting aside something. The other thing, while I'm on a roll, and I hope nobody from Fannie or Freddie are on this call anymore. Let me see. I think I'm safe. But, you know, if they say 10% of the annual revenue for the reserves, it doesn't say anything about the beginning balance. So you can have a building that's 40 years old, exact same buildings next to each other. One has $5 million in a reserve account and they're setting aside 10%. The other one's setting aside percent has nothing in the account. And it's kind of acceptable, but it's very hard to come up with a standard without having a standard in any way other than based on the operating budget. So I can tell you, you know what I'm talking about, that stuff. It's a tough situation. So
yeah. Thank you for taking all my
better to have
questions.
something than nothing, though, I guess. Any other questions? Does anybody want to know what Chelsea's baby's name is?
He's getting fussy right now.
All right, well, if anybody ever has any questions, feel free to reach out to us. If you want continuing education certificate, please send us an email. If you have any concepts in terms of any webinars or that you'd like us to present, let us know, because we're always looking for answers. And also, if you friend me on LinkedIn, just go to LinkedIn and friend Mitch Frumkin. I do on a pretty regular basis something that's called the Kipcon Minute, which I do on a kind of a regular basis. I used to do it every day. Now I do it maybe once a week, where I put things in there in regard to what's going on in our industry, pictures, videos. For example, I'm probably going to post this PowerPoint, and a lot of people look at it. And if you want to be part of that, just friend me on LinkedIn. So we're on Facebook. I started doing on Facebook also. So thank you very much, everybody. And again, if you have any topics, let us know. I went over by 15 minutes only because of the questions, because I was done at 10:30. So everybody have a great day, and thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank
My
you.
email is in the chat. If you email me, I can send you the CEUs. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.